Welcome to Happening Sounds. This is our inaugural episode where we're going to be talking about these key musical questions. And today's key musical question that I present to you, Pat, is the question, are the Beatles really all that important?
Yes.
So make the case for it. If I was a guy that wrote on your Facebook page, hey man, the Beatles really aren't that important, what would you say to that?
I'd say that you're just trying to, you don't like the Beatles, but you can't dismiss what they did for music. Instrumental music was huge up until the Beatles. Instrumental music was the thing. You go to sock hops, you go to school dances, it was instrumental combos playing hits that were written. They're playing the hits of yesteryear. They're covering bigger bands' songs. And then the Beatles came along and they started writing music with words. I mean, lyrics were around, obviously, for hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of years in music. But the Beatles started doing it in a rock and roll vein, and it changed absolutely everything. There's Beatlemania, obviously. There's the tens of thousands, the throngs of screaming people. Mm-hmm. And, I mean, it started with their, I guess, kind of Mercy Beat sound, or their skiffle sound. And then they started getting experimental. They had the fame and the money that they could go into the studio and play with new effects like backmasking and just weird instrumentation and stuff, and change the game. And people who say that they hate the Beatles or that the Beatles weren't important is like saying that Tommy Douglas wasn't important.
Yeah, and I guess when I'm putting together questions for this channel, I'm addressing questions that are brought up in rock criticism in general. And I think for me, this question comes from of being a high school student in the 80s, sort of like in the era right after punk. Mm-hmm. And I think it was sort of cool in that era to sort of reject boomer music and say, well, it all starts now with the punk era, and we should reject everything that came before that. And for me, like growing up in the 80s, for example, it wasn't until much later that I started appreciate things like Led Zeppelin, because that was the music of the earlier generation. And at that time, there was a real rebellion against that era of music, because the boomers had all the money, mm-hmm. and they controlled everything on the airwaves. But I think for me, it's one of those issues of, you can dismiss the Beatles all you want, but they were still a group of profound artistic importance for the era of the 60s. And even today, like when I listen to something, I had some buddies over and we were listening to the track It's All Too Much, mm-hmm. off the Yellow Submarine soundtrack. That's not a Beatles single, so people don't know it so well. So my buddies didn't know, and I played it to them and said, hey, what do you think this sounds like? And they were like, oh, this sounds like Yola Tango or something. So the Beatles, still, even in the modern context, a lot of it doesn't sound dated at all. It's that forward-looking.
And I think that's the big thing, maybe in the circles that we swim in, is the just general dismissiveness. I think people don't want to like the Beatles because it's popular. We were talking earlier about going to the record stores, going to certain record stores where you find an item that is it's a holy grail, but they're blowing it out because either they don't know what it is or it's too popular and it's not cool. I mean, there's a lot of people who thrive in the underground. They like playing something for you. They'll get off playing something for you that you've never heard of before. The more popular, the less cool it is, because the more people that know about it, obviously, it's wallpaper.
Right.
So a lot of people consider, the Beatles and Pink Floyd and even Led Zeppelin and Elvis and bands like that as just kind of musical wallpaper. It's things that everyone has in their collection, therefore, what's special? It's like when you have a band that you love that all of a sudden makes it big. And then, I liked them before they were big. I liked them when they were still playing small shows. I liked them when they were releasing limited run things that only a couple hundred people could own.
And but on a certain level, that impulse makes sense. I mean, a lot of the things that are appreciated on a mass scale of popularity just aren't that good. It's all about the haircuts and the styles that these people are wearing or whatever.
There's the innovators, and then there's like it's a weird thing. It's like the Warhol mass-produced thing. Like his big thing is mass-producing art. Like you could just get it on a print and just make a whole bunch of them and sell them. And that's what a lot of bands, I guess, want to do now. I mean, if you're getting played a ton, you're making a bunch of money in royalties and spins or streams, as it is now. And yeah, people are trying to crack into that. They think that it's an easy thing, but back in the day before all these massive bands existed, these bands are kind of carving their own path. So the Beatles did a whole bunch of stuff that nobody had ever done before, and that people are doing now. I think that they're definitely important. I think that it's a big mistake to dismiss what they did. If you don't like them, that's fine. If you don't,
at least acknowledge that they were important to the development of modern music that's happening today.
Yeah, I think that if you're just trying to say something insane like lizard people rule the earth, or Paul McCartney couldn't write a song to save his life, maybe you should just keep that opinion to yourself. People are going to look at you like you're crazy, and really you're just spouting nonsense.
Yeah, I mean, I think that in pop culture, there are things that are popular, and they're popular for no good reason at all. But then there are these iconic things that come around, like the Beatles or Star Wars or things like this. I mean, that make a profound change in the cultural landscape, and you can dismiss it as not being your thing, but you can't dismiss it as something that has shaped the world around us.
Totally agree. I've gotten into arguments about the Beatles. There's people who are in Camp Beatles, and then fast forward like a decade and a bit, and they're Camp songwriting. He's a total pop musician. John Cale was the avant-gardist in the band, and Sterling was the amazing lead guitarist, and Mo was the primal heartbeat. And there's always the tension on the first two albums, especially when Lou Reed had somebody to fight.
Yeah.
And he had John Cale. But his music is still super, super pop. Like, you listen to Run, 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 you listen to even Heroin. If you just listen to, like, the flow, it's still pretty poppy, and then it kind of goes into the heartbeat pump and the screeching viola, and that's the avant-garde, but it's a nice mix of both. It's the spoonful of sugar in the medicine.
Yeah.
And you had to be indebted to the Beatles.
Yes.
There's even bands like Nirvana, like they covered Beatles songs, and they were a pop band wrapped in this blanket of distortion.
Yeah.
And a lot of bands did that.
But that's funny. Lou Reed as well. There have been interviews where he's dismissed the Beatles, and it's the same thing. Like, obviously, though, the zeitgeist that was around in the 60s was created by what the Beatles were doing, right? So whether Lou Reed likes it or not, I mean, he takes from that, right?
Well, even at the time, I think he was, counterculture. He was trying to like kick against what was coming before and be like, oh no, I'm super original. But like, no, you're writing great music and you're singing about stuff that obviously the Beatles didn't sing about. They didn't sing about transgendered people. They didn't sing about drugs on the street. And if they did, they talked about a lady in the sky with diamonds. Like, they really badly veiled their drug talk. But Lou Reed was like down and dirty, like the hanging out, like in your vein, people in a strange club, where anything goes. Like that.
But it's interesting. Like a lot of, like, we're talking about these people who they kind of come out of this punk influence and punk tradition, and they reject the Beatles, but the Velvet Underground are okay to have as heroes because at first they weren't embraced by mass culture, and then that came later, and they're embraced by all the right people.
All the right people. Yeah. Yes, I think the Beatles are important. I think that a lot of people, as soon as something's popular, dismiss it, it's not cool anymore. My parents like the Beatles. I don't want to be like my parents. Punk rock was the whole shedding of the rock and roll excess and bloat. It was taking the people who were super, super technical and kicking them off their pedestal and saying, look what I can do with my 2 chords. And it was good. The energy that they got was because they were burning what came before. That was the fire. That was, the Beatles were the fuel, and the smoke rising was punk, or no wave, or whatever. There's people who are trying to get as far away from what the Beatles did, and you can argue that that itself is important.
Yeah,
because if the Beatles weren't there, what are they rebelling against? What are they taking a stand against?
Yeah.
So regardless whether the Beatles were important because they influenced a generation of pop songsmiths, or whether they influenced a squat full of punks to do something completely opposite to what they were doing, they still had a massive influence. And I think they're super, super important. Da 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 da.